men, all white, okay, to Latin America. We did send some to Europe, posing as State Department couriers, but primarily into South America to collect foreign intelligence. And I'll always argue with CIA professionals that if you go back and you look at the model of the you go back and you look at the model of the CIA's Directorate of Operations, the clandestine service, as it was structured during the Cold War. It's actually a special intelligence service, an FBI special intelligence service model, as opposed to the OSS model that was prevalent during the Second World War. We can talk about that. If you have any questions about that, we can discuss it in more detail during the Q&A, or if you want to stick around offline afterwards. So I went back and I looked at it, and that was really the topic. And then what I wanted to do, it just gets into the issue of what the book is about. What I wanted to do is to continue that story. I wanted to go back and take a look at, well, what's the story during the Second World War? It's an enormous story. It is a huge story. A few months ago, more than a few months ago, probably last fall, I attended a lecture given by, and his name escapes me, it'll come to me. He wrote the Liberation Trilogy, forgive me, I apologize. His name escapes me. He wrote the Liberation Trilogy. Day of Battle, Army at Dawn, and thank you, Hugh. Rick Atkinson. Thank you very much. And he wrote Guns at First Light, I think, or Last Light, which is the third. And he pointed out that, when it comes to documents, the documents are there. The material is there. He pointed out that there are 25,000 tons of Army records. Okay? Imagine that. 25,000 tons of Army records. Those are just Army records that remain to be sifted. Okay? That's not Navy, that's not Marine Corps. And all of these are the kinds of records that are still out there available. Well, that's what I tried to do. I tried to tap into, tell a story that has never been told before. And I really didn't know how to do it, how to go about it. And what my book is about, after trying to struggle to give it some kind of a form, what I actually do is I start my story off with the weekend before my parents' generation's version of 9/11, and that was Pearl Harbor. And I walk my reader, I start off, I'm not going to go chapter by chapter, please don't have that fear, okay? But I walk my reader through where Hoover was and what he was doing in that weekend before Pearl Harbor. What was he doing Friday? What had gone on during the week? The idea that no one expected this horrific attack on Pearl Harbor, how he left on Saturday afternoon to go to New York, okay? He leaves to go to New York, and for the life of me, I've struggled for 7 years to find out why he went to New York. I never found out until after I published the book, okay, why he went to New York. And he went to New York on a Saturday night. He was spending Sunday in New York because Monday was the closing hearings, the closing statements by the prosecution in the Duquesne case. And he wanted to be there in New York for those, he wanted to be in the audience, in the courtroom to hear the closing statements. But we walk the reader through, and then we take the reader back to the 2 years before that, before Pearl Harbor, and then walk the reader through the rest of the war. And I talk about how the British, I talk about the relationship between the FBI and the British, and I get into a great deal of information and a great deal of detail that has never before been seen. And I also then begin to move into the results of this. In other words, this is a story really that in many respects is only partially told because the story is so large. Again, reverting back to Rick Atkinson, which made me feel better, commented about the fact you have to edit. Certain things are just not going to make it into the book. when he finished his book called Day of Battle, he finishes Day of Battle at the liberation of Rome. And nowhere in any of his three books do you read about the battle that continued up into northern Italy and up into the Po Valley. And if you could ever have the opportunity to go to the American cemetery at Florence, and you see this magnificent, beautiful place with all of these headstones, all of those soldiers died in the Po Valley campaign of northern France. But it never makes it into the book. He moves right into Guns at First Light, and never makes it. And that's what you have to do. You have to edit it down. So what I did was I edited. I dealt with the British side, and then I move into some of the fascinating stories that were so important to the Allied effort in the battle against the Germans. And in doing so, I get into the issue of deception, the deception against the deception against the British, the radio deception in the run-up to the invasion of Normandy. I also get into into certain espionage cases. And I think probably the most important thing that's going to come out to, not necessarily to the reader, but hopefully to the reader, but will come out and be maybe the largest contribution, is the story of how these double agents, one in particular, how the information provided by this double agent to the FBI in November of 1941, remember, November, before Pearl Harbor, how information from this double agent sitting down with an FBI agent in New York who was oblivious to what he's talking about, okay, sits down and he begins, the double agent, or the agent who came out, really wants to cooperate with the FBI, begins to tell the story of how he was required that one of his most important EEIs, essential elements of information that he was to acquire, was the progress that Americans were making in the development of the atomic bomb. And his agent handler in Germany, makes the prophetic statement, and it's right in the FBI file, right in the communication from New York to FBI headquarters, reporting what this agent handler says in Germany. He says that essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, he says the country that is able to harness atomic energy is the country that is going to win this war. And that information, and we can discuss this during the Q&A, we can go into more detail, that information, in my opinion, in my view, based on my research, is what tipped. Wasn't the only piece of information. I don't want to mislead you, but it's what tipped Franklin D. Roosevelt's decision to pursue the atomic bomb. Okay? So this is what the book is about. And as far as my third point, I want to discuss briefly the origins of the relationship between the FBI and the British, and this is focusing on the book. What happens is that in April of Germany declares war with the invasion of Poland in September of 1939. The British immediately declare war on Germany. You have this so-called phony war from September of 1939 until April, May of 1940. During that particular period of time, the head of the British Secret Intelligence Service sends a Canadian to the United States. His name is William Stevenson. Many of you probably heard the so-called man called Intrepid. Well, he is the subject of that book, Man Called Intrepid, and he comes to the United States. He comes to the United States, and he comes because the British Secret Intelligence Service wanted to expand their intelligence apparatus here in the United States. Now, the British, we commonly think that the British were literally everywhere. They had this enormous organization. The truth is very different. In most countries around the world, in fact, practically all countries around the world, the Secret Intelligence Service was under the Foreign Office. They prohibited SIS officers from working out of the embassy. They were only permitted to work as what they call passport control officers in consulates around the world. And the cover was passport control officers. So they were generally a one-man, two-man, three-man office, and this is what you had in New York. Stevenson comes to the United States. He changes all of that under the authority of the SIS. He comes to Hoover, and he asks J. Edgar Hoover's assistance in all of this. Hoover willingly gives this assistance because he has the president's authority to do this. Hoover was no fool. Hoover had giant weaknesses. Hoover had giant strengths, but he was nobody's fool. He's not going to do this without the president's authority. We don't have the actual document because I think a lot of this stuff was just word of mouth. So he gets the green light and he begins to set up, he begins to cooperate with Stevenson. And as Stevenson points out years later in the official history of British security coordination is what it began to be called, Hoover was its licensor. If it wasn't for Hoover, they would not have been able to set all of this up. This relationship works very, very well for about the first 6 months, maybe first year and a half, and then it collapses. It collapses into bitter acrimony. And it collapses into bitter acrimony because, in my view, Stevenson has got his finger in the wind, and he sees Donovan as the best choice in terms of trying to influence Roosevelt and in trying to influence the Oval Office. What happens here is right after Pearl Harbor, this, as I pointed out, this relationship is collapsing beforehand, but with Pearl Harbor, the bottom drops out. And this is where the relationship with the British really drops out. Because the British, Stevenson, wants to basically continue to freelance, wants to continue to run an aggressive intelligence apparatus operations that he ran between April of 1940 and Pearl Harbor. Why? Because it was that twilight period when we were neutral. And we were trying to assist the British, but we want to keep it under wraps. And Stevenson had a free hand. Hoover says, you no longer have that privilege of doing that. We want you to be a liaison service, and here's where the State Department comes in. Because State Department essentially digs its heels in with the British and basically tells the ambassador that, the British ambassador to the United States, that we want the British security coordination to register every one of its employees here, and the British ambassador basically tells them to go scratch. Okay, and he's telling the Undersecretary of State, Sumner Welles, we're not going to do it, and we're not going to do it because William Donovan says we don't have to do it. Okay, so this is where it's called, one of the chapters that I have is called "The Balloon Went Up." Okay, and when he behaved this way, when this reaction occurred, there was an explosion in the government, and the State Department from that point on, essentially, you don't want to say it was an enemy, but essentially had very, very strong ill will toward British security coordination and began to isolate it. From the FBI standpoint, they began to bypass British security coordination. And by November of 1942, Hoover has had it up to about here with the British security coordination in the United States. He is beginning to view them as an obstructionist. He wants to develop direct liaison with MI5, the British Security Service. A senior British Security Service officer comes to the United States in May of 1942 to try and deal directly with the FBI. The FBI is deeply, deeply suspicious of MI5 because of the attitude of BSC, which again we can go into during the Q&A. But by the summer of 1942, the Bureau is beginning to recognize that they have got to do something in terms of direct dealings with MI5. So what do? Hoover sends a delegation to London. The British aren't even expecting them. MI5 is not even expecting them. They just show up. For the next 6 weeks, the FBI gets a tutorial, basically a one-on-one tutorial about how to run a security service. They are introduced to the great names of British security service. Great names like Guy Liddell, who many British consider the greatest counterintelligence officer in British history. Men like Thomas Argyle Robertson, the genius behind the double cross system. John Masterman, who was the head of the double cross committee. Victor Rothschild, who was a fabulously wealthy millionaire, heir to the Rothschild, one of the heirs to the Rothschild fortune, who set up the MI5's counter-sabotage